Hi, everybody. Welcome today to the monthly Hot Planet Repair Team meeting. As you are now aware, we're meeting on a monthly basis instead of every other week. We want to make sure we have more time to delve deep into different topics. Last month was our first real webinar focus on the history of the problem that we're facing. That is all of the trash that we put in our sacred air, land, and water. It is making us have a hot planet. I think that a lot of us are experiencing in different ways. Even sometimes it gets extra cold for some reasons. It's not just hot. It's other different forms of how all of the trash that we've been putting around our world is affecting us deeply. We're all here because we care to repair. So today's meeting is the next step. It's the sequel of last month's meeting, because last month we delved into how the history of these things like the Big Crapple, how New York City used to have so much trash in its streets where people didn't even want to be outside, as well as what we found in London before Jon Snow came in and solved the problem. You had the Thames River, which was completely full of different forms of trash that was killing people, causing cholera. And they realized that the diseases that we're suffering from globally, a lot of it comes from our trash, as well as destroying parts of nature, which give diseases out. I think most people have heard about COVID so far. That's also another problem that we're facing. These viruses come out the more that we trash our ecosystems and destroy them. That's what we focused on last month. And today we're delving a little bit more deeply into what have the solutions been to deal with that trash, and how has that gone wrong, right? And then we'll be expanding onto some different topics there, and then a Q&A session at the end. So please save your questions towards the end, and comments as well, so you all have a lot to offer. Tyler, would you want to jump into actually what have we produced in the problem just in the past year alone?
Yeah, it's been horrible, and I've been watching it from an interesting standpoint. So we have basically 11 billion tons a year created of solid waste, and that's kind of the total addressable market of the problem of what we need to do. Multiply that by basically 5 for the total tons of CO2 emitted into the atmosphere every year. That's a really, really big challenge when you're talking about billions of tons to start pulling out of the atmosphere, out of our waste streams and everything else. I'll be talking a little bit later in the presentation to go into some of these forever chemicals and some of the things that have been found regarding these chemicals in rainwater around the world and animals, and it's causing some really big problems. I was talking to one of the heads of the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality, Stephanie Balliard. She chaired and moderated an Air and Waste Association meeting last month during COP27, but it was at a different event here in North Carolina about the size and scope of the problem. And they don't have any solutions that have been put to work on a large scale that actually are working. It was a breath of fresh air with Carbutura to share with her that we have solutions towards remediating that and basically breaking that down into carbon.
Thanks for handing over, Tyler. So going back to the history of the solutions that humans came up with their different forms of waste they produce, the oldest is compost, likely, and biochar as well. I can't remember which ancient civilizations first used biochar, but it was likely in Africa and South America. This is not something that's new. It's something that we have to recover from the past, which worked really well. You also had supposedly the first composting of human manure to help soil growth and agriculture in Mesopotamia from a clay tablet they found there. Also, ancient writings revealed in China that they would use cooked bones, manure, and silkworms to enrich their soil. People also focused on metal. So I believe it was the Greeks and the Romans and maybe the Egyptians that around 500 BC, they started realizing, okay, metal is one of the most precious things in the world, but we don't have to keep mining it every time. We can use old metal and put it back together for new use. That is an important history of recycling, the ways in which we use metal. One last one I wanted to mention was recycling of paper, what was done in China and Egypt. This is 2000 plus years ago that people realized this is some of the more valuable things they need to do. And then you had the dark ages for around 1500 years where not much really changed. This man named Malthus, I'm assuming he's from Germany. He came up with the idea we've been creating these economies which are linear. and they need to be circular. We need to have these regenerative systems and loops, just like indigenous cultures have understood for a long time. And to this day, all of us came from indigenous cultures that understood the interbeing and interconnectedness of nature and humanity instead of the age of separation, which was created by a lot of different groups out there, whether it was institutionalized religions or other forms of economics, which caused us to separate the human from nature and us to dominate nature. That is not looked well for us, right? The past 10 years have really shown us that separating ourselves from nature is what causes the problem. It's time to end the linear and start having a very circular time together. This man, Boulding, he came up with the term of the open cowboy economy, saying anyone who believes exponential growth can go on forever in a finite world is either a madman or an economist. This was way back in the early 1900s, showing that linear doesn't work. We need to go circular. And then you had the Club of Rome, which was one of the oldest institutions and groups focused on sustainability. I actually got to meet many of the people here at a Dutch barn over in September who were part of the founding of this book and the Club of Rome, The Limits to Growth. People are saying, look, it's been 50 years since they launched this book, The Limits to Growth. And we still haven't realized that the way in which we create our economies, societies, is very linear, and we're running out of the resources that we need to live. We can live in a more abundant world, but that requires that we start changing our agriculture. We start doing things like agroforestry. We turn our trash and other forms of waste into energy and other forms of value that can strengthen our buildings, or yada, yada, yada. The Limits to Growth was a crucial book. And I want to give a shout out to some of this research was done by Metabolism of Cities. Thanks for the research that was pulled out. And in the 1970s, you had the idea of ecological studies coming about, saying there is no waste in nature. In nature, all cycles are closed, just like what we talked about with indigenous wisdom, understanding that everything's interconnected. Mother Nature knows it and it does it the same. Within Mother Nature's world, everything is within that enclosed infinity loops. So that's why we have a lot to learn from Mother Nature and biomimicry. And then the ideal of circularity came about in the 90s with the industrial ecology perspective. Alan, I'm wondering if you'd like to jump in right now and talk about the industrial ecology foundings in the 90s and the past decades.
Sure. Almost all industry is driven by capitalism. Although capitalism can be really good if it's designed to be good, I would say most of our capitalism has not been designed to be good for about the last 200 years. Everything's been extractive. We have a bunch of people that found a lot of free resources that all they had to do was get some capital equipment to extract them and then sell them to people. Well, that's what we're facing now, are these mountains of trash and all the CO2 that's been extracted. We have a lot of lazy processes that just stopped where the dollar was at the peak. We didn't go ahead and figure out that the residue, the trash, the leftover stuff, the emissions can be used. And there's processes that can use every single element of waste. That's really what we have to get to. Right now, 9% recycling of plastics, emissions all over the place. And, you can get an emissions permit, and what that permit does is allows you to emit. I think we need to really go towards a zero emissions and zero waste. And that's what our focus has been.
Thank you very much, Alan, for chiming in there and giving your perspective on where have we been and how we're going to be moving forward. On the next slide, we see here, right when I graduated high school in 2012 is when the world started really waking up to our problem of circularity. Ellen MacArthur and the Ellen MacArthur Foundation was probably the leading nonprofit out there in helping people understand these issues, as well as the Chinese government started doing a better management of its waste systems. Eventually, and I believe maybe it was around 2015 or so, they stopped taking the waste of other countries and had higher standards of it. And then you had other countries like the US panicking, okay, what are we going to be doing with all of our waste? Over the past 10 years, there's been a much greater wake-up call. We can start talking about donut economics, which I'm sure all of you have probably heard of in some way, shape, or form. Kate Rayworth has been the leading mind there on how do we shape our economy more in a circular way, have easy ways for people to understand this. So I think she first started off with a cake model and then eventually moved on to donuts focused on sweet ideas that people understood and could relate to. This is two groups that have played a critical role in changing how we think and approach circularity. Tyler, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, sure. It's been a newer space for me because I've always been dealing with 20 years in the hedge fund industry. It was always brilliant trade thesis of one sort or another to create above market profitability. And no one really thought about the optimization of going from a take, make, waste to a circular economy and what that would do for business models that adopted it, and how it creates a much longer pathway for the business to run and also run extremely well and in balance with the community and the environment. It's been blowing me away because this whole transition is the biggest opportunity in the history of mankind disguised as an existential crisis. And it will be if we don't make the most of this opportunity. But I think it's a turning point for our civilization. It's going to be pretty exciting to see and how it's adopted. If you've got 8.6% of the global economy is circular, then there's a tremendous amount of room for improvement for all of us. Allison, do you want to share your thoughts on this?
This is just a history of when recycling started in the US. Paper has always been one of the things that was easy to recycle. Linen and rags were recycled. They're not really anymore, but they were. What we would call modern recycling started in the 70s and the 60s, but it hasn't really improved very much over that time. There's certainly many people arguing that, in particular, plastic recycling was far more of a marketing tool than an actual recycling program. Pretty much as long as it's existed, people have been arguing that it's not actually true. And I think we've figured that out now, since we know that 9% of plastics are actually recycled and the rest are not. So this is just like an overview of recycling rates around the world. Germany is number one, pretty much number one all across. Wherever you look, Germany comes in first in terms of actually recycling their waste. South Korea is usually number two. Even with Germany at 65%, there's room for improvement. Obviously, North America is lagging, shall we say, behind. Certainly lots of room for improvement. It's a problem. It's a problem that's existed for a long time, and I think people have known about. And I would say that the people who are criticizing recycling are getting heard more often now. This was just some statistics about what is actually recycled. Paper and metal tend to be at the top. Glass isn't always super recycled, but it doesn't tend to end up in a landfill, which is a good thing. So only about 5% of glass ends up in a landfill. The efficacy of recycling is pretty weak across the board. And certainly we all know that plastics is one of the biggest problems. So this is just a plastic myth, which we all know. Single-use plastics obviously are one of the biggest problems. It's just based on this capitalist consumerist society where even people who have a good intent are sold on the idea that if they put it in their recycling bin, it's recycled. And that's not true. Even things that could be easily recycled or do tend to be recycled more often, there's a lot of contamination in recycling bins. And so it never ends up getting recycled anyways. Then there's products like plastic that the symbols on plastic are a bit of a marketing ploy in the sense that you put a symbol on there to indicate theoretically it could be recycled, knowing that it's actually not ever going to be, because either it's a plastic that's so degraded at that point, it's not really worth recycling. That is one of the issues with recycling plastic. It just gets worse and worse and worse and less usable each time you recycle it. Or it's so expensive to recycle, no one's going to do it. Most manufacturers that use plastic will admit that they prefer to just make something new rather than use something that's recycled.
I also want to share with you, Allison, and everybody here that when they say compostable or biodegradable, compostable, it doesn't mean biodegradable. It's different. If it doesn't go to a composter as a compostable material, then it'll go to a landfill. It won't
cause GHG, emissions.
There's a big difference. Biodegradable is biodegradable, but compostable isn't necessarily biodegradable unless it goes to a composter.
One thing I wanted to address from what we've been seeing across some of this history is cities have tended to be the places that cause the most change in circularity. I'd like to pose that as a question to you, Tyler, Alan, or anyone else in the team. What role do cities have to play when it comes to driving circularity towards the future?
Well, they have to take the major role because they're the major source of the pollution. Cities have to get out ahead of it. I think just because the United States has been with the Industrial Revolution, we've done quite a lot of the total global atmospheric pollution. We have the lowest recycling rates and a very bad track record. We also have a track record in our past of legacy waste being shipped all over the world on boats, and then our atmospheric waste, et cetera. We have the obligation to get out ahead of this and address it right now, especially for the cities. Certain states are getting more ahead. And unfortunately, in places like California, being the size of many countries or one of the largest economies in the world, they're coming out with laws that there needs to be a 75% diversion rate, and their whole state is only at about less than 35. Their policies are getting out ahead of their abilities to act and get things implemented and permitted. There's a big problem, and not everybody is really getting ahead of it. And they don't even know how to ask the right questions. A lot of communities, when they're crafting a request for information to solve certain waste problems, they don't even know the right questions necessarily to ask because they've just been doing the same thing over and over again and just burying it. I think a lot of it has almost been educating communities. In regards to these PFAS forever chemicals, this is incredible blowback for poor management of these chemicals and what they're doing. There is a study around the world finding PFAS in rainwater all over the world now. It's in air, fish, soil, being used in pretty much everything. We have to get a handle on it. Many of the current recycling and waste management systems don't address PFAS and don't remediate PFAS. Oftentimes, they just are putting it into these closed concrete bunkers and just saying, oh, we'll just leave it there for now. There's a big situation brewing. The EPA is paying a lot of attention to it right now. My meeting with Stephanie Bolyard last week and listening to her discussion at the Air and Water Management Association really painted the picture. And I'll share a link to that podcast in our group chat. People can listen to that when they have a little bit of time, and it's only about a half hour, but really incredible thought processes going on about the history, the scope of the problem, and certain ways to remediate it. It was a breath of fresh air for her to hear that we've got a solution that remediates PFAS from our waste streams, both current waste streams and legacy waste streams. It's exciting to know that we can scale something that actually is a solution that was pretty much just invisible and under our noses. We weren't really thinking about it. And then recently it's just really blown up for a lot of the people in the environmental and sustainability space.
Thank you, Tyler. This slide that we have here is what we're going to be focusing on next time. Next month, when we're in a new year together in 2023, when we hope to be seeing a global revolution on how we're going to be transforming trash systems and waste and circularity. We have to redefine how we look at trash. Yes, China came up with the great term reduce, reuse, recycle, but we got to really change the systems around this and delve into it in a much more valuable fashion. I believe at Hot Plant Repair Team, it might be a good idea, or with other partners, how do we create a library that focuses on the past, the present, and the future of waste and circularity systems? This is just some books that are some good ideas for those of you that want to delve into it now. But I believe that books are probably the most valuable way that you can change your mind and understand how to approach the world. Eco-literacy is something that humanity really needs at scale and helps grow as leaders and mindset perspective changes. We talked about Kate Rayworth, her Donut Economics book, probably the most famous framework. Then you got some other ones here. You got The Circular Economy, A Wealth Flows by Ken Webster, Cradle to Cradle, Remaking the Way We Make Things. I like this origami they made out of this dollar, but maybe they should have chosen something else other than a dollar for waste. So turning waste to wealth gives us advantages in many ways and can create abundance. We need to focus on design. How do we design our products? We're likely to see some great legislation coming out of the European Union soon on forcing companies to put design in their circularity system. Europe is making some strides in sustainable policy, even though it takes time, as it's one big family with 28 different countries that needs to agree on things. They still tend to lead the way when it comes to policy, where the US and other countries aren't leading the way on such policies. So these standards of how we design these systems They need to catch up to the pace and move into the future. Like Alan says, how do you drag the future into today? Let's hurry that up. The future of packaging is something I'm also really excited about. What Carbotura, a hot planet repair team, will be able to do with the materials they produce from these different waste forms could be used in packaging, likely. But what I am really keen on is the ways that you can use algae and fungi for packaging. Algae and fungi were the two symbiotic friends that crawled out of the ocean when the world was just rock. They vegetated the whole planet and made trees and humans some of their best symbiotic friends. Let's call them our friends, our allies. They're not just organisms. The fungi and the algae, they can be used to create packaging, which once you're done with that packaging, you can toss it out in your compost or in your garden, and that will likely be able to decompose and provide nutrients to your soil. That is a vision that I have and that others are already working on. So maybe we can invite them for a webinar and presentation next year. How is packaging going to be changed? As well as how do we change the way that we produce our built environment? There's going to be ways in which 3D printing is going to be needing to use the different biomaterials that are produced out of these circular systems. So I'm excited. Let's get other people excited. I hope you're all as excited as I am. So how do we value our waste and imperfection? What you're seeing here on the screen is about a 500-year-old tradition from Japan. Japan, as most of you know, is a culture and society that has a deep attention to detail and beauty. I think that is what humanity really needs right now, is to make the world more beautiful, to change how we value things like our waste. In the West, we want everything to be too perfect. If there's a broken bowl, you put it together, that's something that's bad, that's horrible, that's broken. No, what the Japanese have been doing for 500 years is they put together their broken pottery and things, and they use a little bit of gold. Maybe it's not exactly real gold, but they use some sort of gold coloring to show the beauty in the way that they've been able to turn something that was broken back into something that is more beautiful in its new phase. What kintsugi can teach us is pretty valuable. It's built on the idea of embracing flaws and imperfections. And then you can create even stronger, more beautiful pieces of art and forms of value in our daily lives. So I hope that you all can go about thinking about these things and talking to others around you and your communities and life on how can we start valuing our waste better. I think the first thing that we can all start doing as individuals is composting. I think every single one of us, including myself, can do a better job at this. How do we get our communities to start composting better? And then how do we get our communities and governments to start focusing on the technologies like what Hot Planet Repair Team and others will be able to do to transform their waste systems? So thank you all today for joining in. If anyone else on the team wants to jump in, please do before we close up, or any questions and comments are welcome as well.
Just wonder about other cities. I live in Calgary, Alberta, and they do compost pickup here every week. Do they not do that in your cities? No? Yeah, they gave us our own couple buckets and garbage cans and everything for composting. It made it easier. Not everybody has joined the composting team, but the city is trying at least. So
Yeah, Toronto has been doing it for a long time. We have 4 bins. We have a green bin, that's your food waste, the blue recycling bin, the yard recycling, and then your regular garbage. And the only one you pay for is your regular garbage. So there's an incentive to separate.
We find in Calgary, they're doing a lot of throwing the wrong things in the compost, which is not helping.
Bringing a lot of cross-contamination.
Yeah, a lot of things to get through there, a little loophole to get the public in with it, but they're trying. That's a good start.
Well, thank you, Nancy, and thank you, everybody. I look forward to seeing everybody next month, and please communicate on the HPRT thread and KOL. Great to see everybody. Thank you.
Bye, guys. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
Bye, guys.